and I was able to rectify the
A
situation.
lot to know.
Yeah, it's fun though. I mean, it's pretty easy, and then it works well to let people be able to join in via the chat versus if you live stream the Zoom meeting itself, there's other people popping on and phones and such, and that gets a little complicated. I think I could maybe do it as like a Zoom webinar, but this is the system I know, so I'm going with it. But yeah, so we've got 40 folks on right now, which is awesome. And then that's 40 viewers. I know sometimes we have classrooms who are watching. So hello, if our fourth and fifth graders are joining in from Verona. And I know we also have some municipal staff from around the state. So thanks to everybody who knows myself, knows Shannon, and thanks to you, those of you who don't, for joining us today. So it is 12:30, so I think we'll get rolling here. My name is Allison Madison, and I am the program manager at Wisconsin Saltwise. And for those of you who haven't joined in, Wisconsin Saltwise is a coalition of organizations across Wisconsin that are working to reduce salt pollution in our lakes, streams, and drinking water. And today, I want to give a special shout out to a number of universities and school districts across Wisconsin that have been working to adopt best practices by educating their staff and training people who are doing winter maintenance, incorporating brine, really dialing in mechanical removal, so moving as much snow as possible so that there's less, and maybe sometimes you can get away without salting. So I've worked personally with staff at Madison Area Technical College or Madison College, UW Green Bay, UW Whitewater, UW Eau Claire, the Superior School District, and Wausau school districts are just some of the leaders. I know Mequon, Thiensville, in the Milwaukee area, those are leaders across the state in adopting some of these practices, and then also really want to acknowledge that many of them have stepped up and have been sharing kind of what's working for them, sharing their stories with others in their area so that we can all move farther faster together in this work. So thank you all for that. And with that, I'm going to be turning it over to Shannon Haydin with the Wisconsin DNR to talk to us about this problem kind of statewide, what we're seeing, what's being done. And if you have any questions during her presentation, please just type those right into the YouTube chat, and then I will field those questions, or I guess Shannon will field them. I'll read them off to her at the end. So thank you very much.
All right, so as Allison shared, I am the stormwater section manager for the department. So my job is to implement the state's stormwater program in compliance with the Clean Water Act, and then also our delegated authority from US EPA. So EPA has granted us the authority as a state to issue a variety of permits under that program. I won't get down into those details too much. But so I'm here to talk about a year-long effort that the department undertook across a variety of project areas or program areas around chlorides. What I'm sharing right now is the list of our work group that was assembled to discuss chlorides and try to come up with a strategy for the state. It's important to understand who these folks are and who put it together. So we have what's called the Water Initiative Steering Committee. It's an informal group of leaders across the variety of our water programs that you're seeing: wastewater, water evaluation, Office of Great Waters, drinking and groundwater. All those folks meet every 3 months to talk about things that are water quality related that we all have touch points around. So chlorides was one that rose to the top last year. It's been discussed quite a bit, but we finally have an opportunity to all come together and come up with a strategy for the state of Wisconsin. So we started out with developing a work plan, and then we gathered data, we heard from experts, we talked to other states, and we ultimately developed 16 recommendations Again, I think it's important for everybody to understand that some of those recommendations are high level, some of them are things that we can control as a department, and then there are other things that would need additional partners or even legislative action to implement. So why do we even start talking about chlorides? Why do we bring this group together? Primarily, some of our folks in our wastewater program and our stormwater program, we're looking at the fact that we're seeing an increase in chlorides statewide. What I'm sharing on my screen right now is a map showing the trends of chlorides across all of the long-term trend water sampling sites that we have. Some of these sites have had samples going back into the 70s. So since that time, we're seeing a clear increase in chlorides at all of our stations. And we're seeing some pretty significant increases near the Rock River, where it goes into Illinois, and then also southeast Wisconsin in the Milwaukee area. I'm going to throw a couple numbers out at you just to keep in mind. So Wisconsin's water quality criteria for chronic toxicity is 395 milligrams per liter. And once you exceed those criteria, waterways can be listed on what's called the 303D impaired list. 303D is a specific section within the Clean Water Act. And under that section, states are required every 2 years to compile a list of rivers and waterways that ultimately are not meeting these water quality criteria. And in Wisconsin, we currently have 50 rivers and 1 lake that exceed that criteria and are impaired for chloride. So that's just kind of a background. It's getting higher, and we have some impairments. The next thing that we looked at was chloride levels in our public drinking water. We heard yesterday, if you joining the series of webinars from Allison Couture, who's a doctor, talking about the impacts of salt in our diet. And there was 2 reasons why we wanted to look at these data. Number one, we wanted to understand what's going on in our groundwater. So what I did is I took data from the last 20 years, because that's about how old our stormwater program is. So that seemed like a logical cutoff for me. So took data from the last 20 years from our groundwater retrieval network and cut out the data that showed levels of chloride at 125 milligrams per liter or less. And the rationale for that was it's a preventive action limit for public welfare groundwater quality. 250 is the standard that we have in our state, where we start to see aesthetic issues, odor, taste, color, things like that. It's important to note that the standards for chlorides are not necessarily at the same level as a public health concern as other contaminants like nitrate and arsenic, but it could be an issue for individuals on a low salt diet. So those are all things to keep in mind. I also want to point out again that 395 acute or chronic standard and 757 acute. So that acute level, any exposure of aquatic organisms, it can be immediately toxic. So in light of that, if you take a look at the map, there are the really big fat circles. Those are what groundwater samples that ultimately were showing between 851 and 1,100 milligrams per liter in that groundwater sample. And that's high, that's really high. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that our groundwater is a source of surface water. So during, well, I guess at all times, and sometimes it's more evident during low flow conditions when you have flow and not a lot of rainwater coming from the sky, you're getting inputs into your rivers, lakes, and streams from that groundwater. So when we're seeing these really high levels of chlorides in our groundwater, we should take notice, because that is ultimately discharging to the surface water. And how did the chlorides get in there? There's a variety of ways that it can get in there. I think it's really important for everybody to understand that chlorides do not go away. They will dissolve, they will wash off our streets, our sidewalks, our parking lots, and go into the storm sewer, and then ultimately into our water bodies, the nearest river, lake, stream, wherever that is going. It is not, in fact, going to a wastewater treatment plant to be cleaned up. So something to keep in mind when you see all that salt on the sidewalk, it's going to end up in your favorite nearby water body. The other thing that I think is important to understand, though, is because it persists forever, as that salt is infiltrated into the ground. So let's say you live in the country and you have a road ditch instead of a storm sewer or curb and gutter, that chloride will ultimately make its way through that soil column and then into the groundwater. So there's a variety of things that are impacting what's happening. The other thing that I think is important just to keep in mind with this map is that some of these samples were over numerous years. I picked the highest one just to kind of get a feeling for what was going on at that site. So the worst possible case scenario, I guess, if you will, is shown on this map. So as a group, another thing that we really wanted to kind of understand is to visualize where our wastewater treatment facilities have variances for their chloride discharge. So I mentioned that EPA authority. So this is one of the permits that we issue in Wisconsin as we cover wastewater treatment facilities. Originally, 93 facilities were given a variance to discharge higher levels of chlorides from the end of their pipe than perhaps would have otherwise been allowed. And then in exchange, they have a plan to reduce their chloride. So some communities have ultimately come into compliance. About 32% of them have. We still have nearly 50 that are covered under a variance, and our wastewater program is working with them to come up with other treatment options, or so there's some creative source area control plans that are occurring in some of the communities. But just important, take a snapshot. These are communities that have variances for chloride. So the next thing we wanted to do as a group is try to understand where there's touch points where communities have a high level of chloride in their well, and then they also have a variance for their wastewater treatment plant. Southeastern Wisconsin, we can see a correlation a little bit there, right? But we don't have any wells in, wastewater treatment facilities in central Wisconsin currently with a variance. So there's something going on, perhaps in the center of the state. I think probably some geology is contributing to why you're seeing higher levels of chlorides there versus some of the land use, that urban land use that we see in our southeast and south central region. But the reason why it was important to look at this together is we wanted to be able to, where we have an opportunity, talk to communities about what they're doing on the landscape in terms of winter maintenance and how that impacts them in their bottom line, whether it's in their drinking water well or at their wastewater treatment facility. Are you just overpaying for using too much salt in all of these different areas? And I think, looking at this map, there's certainly some communities that we can reach out to. And one of our recommendations does kind of speak to that. So after we looked at data and we talked about what's going on, we brought some folks in. We brought our very own here, Allison Madison. She kind of kicked off what we're seeing and why we care. We brought in DOT, Jim Hughes. DOT has been doing some really amazing things in trying to reduce their salt use, but still make things safe for travel. Talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Southeast Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, they are doing a very comprehensive multi-year study about the inputs of chlorides, and some really great work coming out of there. We heard from them. Lexi Pasante, we have since, she was a researcher at the School of Freshwater Sciences studying salt-loving bacteria. We brought her into our program in Southeast region. She is a stormwater specialist, but Lexi was discovered these salt-loving bacteria in the Milwaukee area that should not be there. So her very important work helped inform and further support that we have an issue we need to deal with. Sean Giblin is a biologist for the department, and he works on the Mississippi River, and he did some research on what was happening over there. We heard from him. And then finally, we brought a gentleman named Stephen McCracken in from Illinois. He helps run the Illinois DuPage Salt Creek Work Group. And Illinois they were kind of where we are now, at the precipice of needing to do something. And so this work group came together. It's primarily communities, a few nonprofits working for water quality improvements, and a lot of what they were doing was in talking and training communities on their winter salt use to reduce how much salt is going into their waters. So the biggest thing we talked about with them is this thing called a TMDL, so a total maximum daily load. That is the amount of a single pollutant that that watershed can accommodate. So right now we don't have any TMDLs in Wisconsin. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's a tool that is used when there's an impairment of a water body to bring it out of impairment. So a big study is done of that watershed. They look at all the different inputs. They look at all the different people who are discharging, and then each of those dischargers gets an allocation, and then it gets reduced over time to eventually achieve that desired water quality and hopefully delist the water body. But you'll hear about this a little bit more in a couple of other instances. Maryland is one of the communities that we talk to, in part because they do have a TMDL. They've developed a TMDL for their chloride impairments, but they've decided to make it a voluntary framework versus regulatory. There was some legislation that was proposed there to require the TMDL to be implemented from a regulatory perspective, but it did not pass. So right now they're implementing their TMDL voluntarily. And I also thought it was important to note in 2011 that their highway administration was required to reduce salt. So there was what's called a consent decree from US EPA that told them they needed to do something. So ultimately, all of their contractors and employees attend salt university training every year, I believe. Our friends in Minnesota really have paved the way. Next door to us, they have, similar to us, 50 water bodies listed as impaired for chloride, but they have 40 TMDLs that are developed, or those 40 plans developed to reduce chloride. And having those TMDLs really, I think, started to be the impetus for change there. So in 2016, they developed the Twin Cities Metropolitan Area Plan, the state's equivalent to EPA, I guess, did that plan after they were noticing some alarming trends in some of their waters. And they converted that to a statewide plan in 2021. Other things of note, they adopted liability limiting legislation in 2022. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute when I talk about New Hampshire. They developed a model ordinance for communities to manage salt use. And there was a little nugget that I found in one of their reports that said that studies show training reduces salt use by 30 to 70%. I understand that's a very wide range in reduction, but even a 30% reduction will help slow the rise of chlorides in our water bodies. So New Hampshire, again, remember we talked about that consent decree. Their road DOT was in trouble, needing to reduce chlorides as well. So what they shared is they took the lead from the ski industry, which they have very prevalent in their economy, recognizing that people put sticks on their feet and slide down an icy hill every day, and they sign off on any liability. And so they took some of that language. And so what this liability limiting law does in both New Hampshire and Minnesota, and there's some soon to be introduced legislation here in Wisconsin, is it says you're an applicator. So let's say I'm running a landscape business. I get trained on the right use of the right salt at the right time. I get certified, and then I document when I do my work. So on Tuesday, if I went to 5 places, I can document what I did, how much salt I used, etc. And then if there is a slip and fall under that state law framework, the applicator is not held liable. Slip and fall liability, I will share with you. We did a survey this summer. We did it with businesses and communities. Communities have a little bit different legal liability around slip and fall than private businesses do. But slip and fall liability was reported by, I believe it was 70% of our private businesses, whether it's a business owner or a contractor, as a driving factor for them using salt. So there's this perception that to be safe, to eliminate slip and fall, to be alleviated of any of that liability, that you need to just dump a ton of salt. And we know that that's not true. People frequently are using more salt than they need to, but they also can create an unsafe situation by having too much salt as well. So that's when we talk about slip and fall liability, that's what we're talking about. And then we also wanted to hear from people who were doing work in our state. So as I mentioned, we had DOT came and spoke with us. DOT has been reducing the amount of salt they're using for quite a few years. I'll share some data with you in a minute, but you can see this graphic on the screen. This is from Michigan DOT. And what Jim Hughes shared with us is that seeing this graphic really kind of informed some of their thinking. What it's showing is the amount of hard, like rock salt, that bounces off the roadway. So you can see in the middle of the lane, it's pretty significant. The further out that you get from that drive lane, it gets reduced, obviously. But, you know, DOT and others are spending money salting that, and with, you know, product that ultimately bounces off the roadway and never does its job. So that, I think, was a little bit of an aha moment for them, and where they started switching over to using brine. I think it's important to also note the work of the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association. I'll talk about them in a bit. Regional Planning Commission, UW Wisconsin, and the School of Freshwater Science are all doing some really amazing work around chlorides and trying to understand what's happening in our state. So this is a little conversation about DOT. The graphic on the left that is, you know, orange and red and green, that comes from an organization called Clear Roads, and they are a kind of an interest group, if you will, or a group where states kind of come together and talk about what they're doing, communities as well. So people who are doing winter road maintenance for the public. So this was some data from them, just to kind of get a feel for how many lane miles Wisconsin has. We've got 34,000 compared to Illinois' 45,000. We're right in line with some of the other states. And then showing how much rock salt and brine that we've been using. So you can kind of see how we compare to other states. And, you know, there's certainly some areas where we're doing really great. There's certainly some areas to work toward improvements. But I think overall, the message is shown in the bottom right-hand corner in the blue graph. This is data from DOT's winter road maintenance report. And you can see the amount of rock salt, or the tons of salt per lane mile, have been decreased by almost half since in the 2017, so in the last 5 years. And then you can see the amount of brine that they're using has gone up dramatically as well. It's almost doubled. And what they've shared is the number one driving factor was money, using money to pay for salt, and then also money for damage of equipment and infrastructure, bridges, all of that stuff. They recognize that they had to make a change. So the fact that it helps the water quality was certainly a bonus that they noted, but their, you know, primary factor was trying to save some money. So after we got together for, I guess probably at this point, we decided to make some recommendations, and and these recommendations are intended to change behavior, reduce salt that's going into our waterways, and then ultimately improve water quality. And as I mentioned, some of these are things that are out of my control or my program's control. Some of them would require legislative initiatives. Some of the things that we're recommending ultimately have their own legal processes that they need to go through. But we wanted this process that resulted in a final report to be a conglomeration of all the information that we reviewed, so that we could always go back to it and say, oh, we talked about that. Oh, we heard about that. Or we made a recommendation, and here's a resource that we can put with it. So the first area are things that are DNR programs that we could implement with some partnership with others. So our Sustainability and Business Support Program has a green tier program certification for businesses, but we think perhaps there could be something similar for smart salting, and if people are getting trained. And that is a conversation we haven't had yet, but we will. in the programs that I manage, urban runoff, and then my counterparts in wastewater, remember when we talked about the groundwater well samples and the wastewater treatment plants? So we have communities are required, certain communities are required to get a permit for their discharge of stormwater. So there's 250 of those are municipal stormwater permittees. That's what the MS4 is. So within our control, we have the opportunity to help them develop salt reduction education programs and things like that. So that's something that we want to keep in mind, is that education and outreach piece for our permitted communities, requiring those communities to report basically a spill of salt into those storm sewers. Obviously some caveats to that. And then we also are recommending that we continue with these variance processes where they come up, and working with our permittees to reduce our chloride discharges. You've heard me talk quite a bit about the TMDL. I mentioned we hadn't had one yet developed for the state of Wisconsin, and we are actually embarking on one at this point. And in part, I think because of all the work that folks had done on this, when the opportunity arose and EPA came to the table and said, hey, Wisconsin, we have some money to develop a TMDL, we said, oh, we need one for chloride. So EPA and some of the folks here at DNR are working on a TMDL for the Kinnickinnick River watershed. So it's a small urban watershed in the Milwaukee area. And we're really hoping that that will kind of be a driving factor or model for other TMDLs in the state. And then we're recommending that when the time comes, there's a multi-year cycle, and that is not my area of expertise, but on a routine cycle, the state does update our water quality criteria, and we are recommending we do so for chloride. Haven't picked a number, haven't gotten that far yet, but there are some other states that are lowering that chronic and acute number. I believe EPA will be coming out with a lower number, so we will be needing to look at that, and that's recommended here. Our drinking water and groundwater program has committed to incorporating additional drinking water requirements for sampling. So reporting out chlorides and sodium each year in that community confidence report. If you haven't seen it, you want to understand what the state of your drinking water is in your community, just Google community confidence report and put in your city, and you will get results. Offering state revolving loan funds. The state does have low interest loans that we give out to communities for a variety of projects under our clean water and safe drinking water funds. So we do know that communities are interested in acquiring brining equipment and doing outreach programs and using these SRF funds. So we are in the process of talking about that as well. Rebate programs, this is not necessarily something that the department would manage, but we put it here as a placeholder that some communities are making incentives for people to trade out their water softeners so that they're pushing less chloride into the wastewater stream. And then finally, from an agency perspective, working with EPA and reversing the trends in chloride levels. There's, again, already some work going on around that, which is exciting. Then these are the final recommendations that are maybe need to be noted, but perhaps are not a DNR initiative. Number one, leading by example for state-owned properties, having contractors and other individuals who are plowing our facilities, like DOC, state parks, those getting trained in salt-wise or smart salting practices, and then also reducing water softening at state-owned and operated facilities. Obviously, sometimes it's going to be necessary, but do we need to do some recalibrations or something like that? And then finally, things that would require either the governor's office or a legislative initiative, reducing that slip and fall claim liability, something I talked about, updating statutes to allow private entities to take advantage of municipal resources for brining. This was something that our DOT mentioned was a barrier sometimes for the private sector to start with some of the brining activities. We anecdotally had heard that sometimes private contractors in that late spring will perhaps overuse salt because they don't want to have to unload it and deal with storing it for the summer. So we recommend where a community might have an opportunity and they're seeing that happen, perhaps they might make available some storage space for contractors to come in and leave that. And then finally, the final recommendation was the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association, which is all of the states in that Upper Mississippi River Basin, so including Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, all come together to talk about water quality concerns in that basin. And they specifically adopted a resolution kind of asking for some steps to be taken by EPA and kind of as a concerted effort around chloride reductions. And so we wanted to really make sure to note that that was out there, and that if there's opportunities to take a piece of it from a legislative perspective or from a governor's initiative, we wanted to memorialize that. So that's what we have been spending our year on around chlorides at the DNR.
Awesome, Shannon. Thank you so much. Let me pop back on here. If you don't mind ending your screen share, I will switch us over and we'll start taking some questions. So perfect timing. We got 1 o'clock. If people need to pop off, we understand, but if you're able to stick around, we have a few questions that have popped in already, and we can continue to take more. So the first question actually came in over, let me try to pull this up here, email. So if you have any issues with the chat, you can email me at wisaltwise@gmail.com. And there was a question about the impact that higher chloride levels might have on our indoor plumbing.
Ooh, I can very minimally speak to this in that that hasn't necessarily been my area of expertise, but the little bit of reading that I have done and my little bit of understanding around that is it can have an impact in terms of how it interacts with perhaps metals that are in your pipes. So if you have lead pipes and you have high chlorides coming in, you may have some of that leaching out of that lead into your water that you're then drinking.
Yeah, I would, without being alarmist, if you want to read a little bit more about this, the lead crisis in Flint was exacerbated, not caused, but exacerbated by the fact that they had switched over to water from the Flint River was a little saltier, so higher amounts of sodium and chloride, and that ion exchange was happening, as Shannon mentioned. So if you want to Google like Flint, lead crisis and put in salt, or maybe the word chloride, sodium chloride, that might pull up something you can read and look at some diagrams on that. All right, so our next question, actually kind of comment, was that we need a PSA to deal with excess salt on surfaces after the snow is gone, like sweep it up, reuse. I did put in there that the North Central Stormwater Coalition recently created a PSA like that. So I know their intent was to make that publicly available if people want to pop in their logo for different parts of the state. I don't know, Shannon, is the DNR working on any sort of PSA or other educational materials?
At this point, no, but there's certainly opportunities there.
Okay. The next question came in from Lance. The brine numbers were now millions of gallons. So noting that increase that you had, described. So how much total salt is used in brine compared to rock salt in the state per mile?
Ooh, I don't know that math. Do you, Allison?
So I can speak to that a little bit, Lance and everybody. So in general, brine is 23.3% salt in the solution. So brine being salt and water. Sometimes there are other additives, but most of the time it's salt and water. So roughly a quarter salt by volume. And then I would say by weight, I think is more accurate. But brine helps reduce total salt use in a few ways. I think you've mentioned, or definitely over the course of the week, we mentioned that idea of like anti-icing, putting it down before the storm, preventing the bond from forming. So sometimes if that's able to be done before the storm, you can reduce maybe the number of applications of salt afterwards. I don't want to always say eliminate, but if you are even reducing it kind of by one run, you got to do a bit of math in there, but I'd say it's roughly like you've got a 75% kind of savings in total salt use. As Shannon mentioned earlier, that idea of rock salt scattering. So if you're pre-wetting your rock salt with some brine, you're keeping the salt in place. And again, that's enabling us to kind of ratchet back those application rates. And so that might be dropping application rates of like total salt, including the use of brine in that. Total salt applications may be going down, roughly 50%. Maybe that's a little on the high end, but I'd say even with the fact that we are using salt and brine, but it's enabling total application rates to go down. And sometimes that's kind of hard to tease out, in individual storms. But I think at the macro level, as Shannon shared, this idea that with education adopting BMPs, we're seeing salt use go down 30 to 70%. So brine being a big factor in those reductions. All right, so Paul has mentioned that he's seen beet juice application used instead of sodium chloride for roads in the winter in years past. What's the status of this? Is it effective? Is it still being pursued?
It is used on a case-by-case basis. Our wastewater program has to review it because it is a waste. And one of the things that can be a problem is it can be high in nutrients. So some of these byproducts create what's called a biological oxygen demand issue, or BOD issue, which is another water. We don't want to create another water quality concern by trying to manage for another one. So as those opportunities come about, then we take a look at them, look at the chemistry, the biology, and make a decision if it's appropriate. So it's been some use of that off and on, but not widespread.
Yeah. And I would say that like straight beet juice isn't really something that is used by municipalities. It's most common at this point, if people are going to use beet sugars, that they are processed and mixed in with maybe some other chlorides like calcium, magnesium chloride into proprietary products. Like beet heat is one on the market. AMP is another one that have some sugars in them, and sugars can actually help the salt stick on the road. It's a tackifier, keeps the salt where we want it to be. And salt, those sugars are corrosion inhibitors too. So that's like another benefit that we get. But as Shannon mentioned, sugars, they're yummy, right? For the microbes in the water. So if large quantities of them are showing up in the water, it ends up driving down oxygen levels. So yeah, just had to throw a few more things in there from what I see it more like the operator kind of operation standpoint.
Yeah, thank you, Allison.
All right, so a question, totally switching gears here. Lynn is asking, for the water softener rebate program, do you mean people are switching to no water softener or moving people to softeners that discharge less salt?
I think the incentive is to just move to a different softener. I don't know of any communities that are paying people to not soften their water unless they're going to some kind of community-wide softening, which is another thing that we noted in our report that communities might choose, but there's some pros and cons to that. But yeah, I think just making sure your softener is newer, up to date, calibrated, and installed properly, and that you know how to manage for it. So if you're going to go buy a new one, you're going to get some money back from a community that's participating in that.
And I just put a link into the chat about water softeners. So as Shannon mentioned, that idea of like optimizing your softener, I kind of bring up the metaphor of, if you had your AC turned down to, like 50 degrees, you'd recognize like that's more than you need. But with our water softeners, we don't always know that. And then also those older water softeners recharge just every like 2 or 3 days, regardless of how much soft water you've used. And that would be like going to the gas station every 2 or 3 days, emptying out your gas tank, regardless of how much gas is in it, and just refilling it. So really wasteful. And we really want to move people away from those older timer-based systems to newer demand-based systems. But there are some salt-free alternatives on the market that people are using and are happy with. So looking into those, they're kind of like maybe where the electric cars were, 20 years ago. It still feels a little bit more experimental, but it's definitely the direction we need to move people towards. But even if you've got that old clunker and you can get a more fuel efficient, salt efficient softener, that's a big win too.
I really liked your analogies, Allison. Those were really great.
Thanks, Shannon. I've been doing this a little bit. So. All right. Aaron has asked, what can wastewater treatment plant facilities do to remove the chloride in fresh water?
There's tertiary treatment where they just what is it, reverse osmosis, Allison? Yeah. But there's a point where that's very expensive and might not be effective either. So for our, I know the Madison Metropolitan Sewage District has a variance for their chloride discharge, and the amount of money that they would have needed to spend to do mechanical treatment was so much that they are really looking at source area reductions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So reverse osmosis is the only way we can really pull those tiny little sodium and chloride ions out of the water. And as Shannon mentioned, the expense of that, it's driven by the energy it takes. And energy, think, a lot of greenhouse gases, right? So are we going to pay money to pump greenhouse gases in the air to try to pull the salt out of our wastewater? Instead, can we keep it out at the front end? And there's definitely no way we can't run reverse osmosis on our lakes, right? There'd be no life left in them. So looking at, again, that source reduction. All right. So Lisa has asked, Madison now has an ordinance. So the city of Madison has an ordinance so that homeowners are required to remove excess salt after ice or snow recedes. She's saying, enforcement's another question. But I guess, is that something that maybe, Shannon, that you see as a benefit, kind of asking people to sweep up extra salt?
I think if you can sweep up extra salt, you absolutely should. I see it all over the place. I know Madison also has a reporting where you can report businesses that are oversalting. And, Madison's the only place where I've seen this done. But yeah, anytime you can reduce how much salt you have on the ground, the better off our waters are going to be.
Great. And I'm going to put a link into the chat again. This is a spot oversalting reporting form for Dane County. And then the city of Madison, as Shannon mentioned, and our participant Lisa mentioned, has their own kind of reporting. One thing I'd say with that is, again, it's limited kind of staff capacity to get that education and get the word out. So if any of you as citizens are able to have those conversations, with your neighbors, with the owners and managers of the stores that you're walking into, I think that really goes a long way.
The other thing I would add, Allison, is just, I think people just don't know. They don't know how much is too much or how much is not enough. And so everybody's just doing the very best that they can. I don't know. I want to make sure that people aren't trying to do something wrong on purpose. I feel like if people knew, they would absolutely change. And anyway.
Yeah, I definitely feel like when we're having these conversations, it really is just that education. People think, they're putting salt down, it's doing good, right? We put it down to try to keep people safe. And of course, that fear of liability maybe drives us to way over apply. But in general, not coming at people. You don't want to attack anybody for doing something that is the intent is good. Okay, so Joseph did some math here. So there's 2.2 pounds of salt in a gallon of brine. So,
okay.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. And then I think, it's doing, I don't know, Lance, if that helps you, if you want to do some back of the envelope calculations there. But like I said, it's, looking at all the ways that brine is beneficial and can drop salt use, whether it's the number of applications that are going out or the amount of salt kind of per lane mile in a given application. And then with brine, also the ability that we have to add some of those sugars or other chlorides that can help, as Shannon said, using the right material in the right amount at the right time. So it's really moving to those precision applications of really the right material at the right time, not just always salt, more the better. So we've got another comment here, I guess, from Nick saying on-demand softener is really the way to go. So perhaps Nick has seen the benefit in his own home of that. I've definitely heard people say like they had no idea, when they were able to replace a softener, and they're making so many fewer trips down with those giant bags of salt down the basement steps. Another question or comment, let me read this here. Without a liability law in place yet, how do you convince the government to lead by example to reduce salt at their facilities when they're so concerned about liability and have heavy traffic and use? So how do we get the government to lead by example at their own buildings, Shannon?
Oh boy. We talk about it, I think here at the state, we're talking about it. Hopefully it trickles up to the people who make those decisions. I am seeing communities, whether they're counties, cities, village, towns, getting the training and doing more and touting it. The community that I live in our newsletter, they were bragging about how they're changing their salting, and also setting the community expectations about what they might see. So they might see a little more salting at the intersections, but not along the entire roadway. And that doesn't mean that the city isn't caring, but they're being mindful. So, or you can, call your legislator and say, we think this is a good idea. I don't know. But having those conversations, I think, will go a long way.
Yeah, and there has been a recent bill introduced by State Senator Andre Jacques. He's looking for co-sponsors on a limited liability bill. So you really could call up your legislators and tell them that you're in favor of legislation that would help reduce salt pollution. Now would be a good time for that. Mary, we got another comment here from Lance. Lance said, stopped using his softener when he started learning about this problem 12 years ago. Still looking into saltless alternatives, but not impressed to buy one yet. So someone who's gone without a water softener for a dozen years. And of course, this, might vary depending on where you're living in the state, kind of what your water hardness is, what your tolerance is for that. The biggest concern is, that hard water buildup, right, in our water softener, in our water heaters and maybe dishwashers, if you've got one. And then other parts of the state where it's not necessarily water hardness, but iron is the driver of water treatment. I would really, really encourage people to move away from a water softener that's kind of a universal Band-Aid and move towards an iron curtain or a filter that's going to just pull the iron out and be really specific to that issue.
One thing I wanted to mention, Allison, if you don't know what your hardness level is, you can go to that community confidence report for your drinking water that I mentioned previously, and it will tell you what your hardness is. And then maybe you can make some decisions as to whether or not you feel like you need to even be softening water. Do a little bit of research for yourself.
Mm-hmm. And other things to look at would be maybe a blending valve with your softener. So you're not necessarily softening all the magnesium or removing all the calcium and magnesium from the water, but using water with some of those elements in it. In Europe, I've heard, and I haven't really dug into this and hardness in different countries, but I've heard that they can't pull all the calcium and magnesium out. They have to leave some of it in. But in the US, we're generally softening down to 0. So again, that idea of, is your AC, does it need to be at 55 or 60, or could you tolerate it at 68 in the summer? Nick has asked about what alternatives I've seen. So, or I guess maybe for you, Shannon, I don't know, do you want to talk about different water softeners? And I think we're still talking about water softeners, alternative water softeners, but
I don't have a lot of expertise in that. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking you will have more.
Yeah, so on our water softener page, which I put in the chat, there's a little YouTube video about a salt-free softener that uses electricity to affect the, give me a second, electron spin, I believe, of calcium magnesium ions so that they are not binding with carbonate and forming that scale on pipes. That's my understanding right now. EMF devices. I've also seen TAC, template assisted crystallization devices, which also use a resin tank, kind of similar to what we see with our traditional softeners, but at different resin kind of sites on those resin beads, the calcium magnesium ions are encouraged to bind with one another and form little seeds. And so they're not, again, binding with carbonate and forming that scale on the pipes. So those are a couple. I believe the template assisted crystallization ones were the type of softeners used in a Waterloo study, which is linked again on that home water softener page that I put into the chat. And then I have a friend in the Madison area who recently got a softener, a salt-free softener. So technically it's called a water conditioner to pull the calcium and magnesium out. And there's like little filters that he has. And I believe he changes them out like every year or a couple years. But again, it's a salt-free option that, I mean, again, this is one person's story, but he said it's working pretty well. I think he did say he's noticed it doesn't do as good of a job of dealing with the hard water scale, but he's been happy with it. Let's see here. We've got, yeah. So just some more comments about that idea of kind of what our aim with those water softeners is to make less scale kind of build up. We don't necessarily have to pull the calcium magnesium out as long as they're not creating problems.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, give another moment here in case anyone has a question, but I think we're good. Shannon, we've definitely taken up more than half an hour of your time. So thank you so much for joining on today and sharing kind of what the DNR has been up to in the last year with regards to chlorides, quite a bit. And we look forward to more things coming down the pipe. And I look forward to hopefully joining back in with many of you tomorrow to talk more about kind of what we can do as citizens in the state, ways to kind of connect with other groups and continue to build the SaltWise network. So
thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.